everybody. Welcome back up to the Vinyl Attic. We're up here in the Vinyl Attic for another episode of Vinyl Fetish, where we're doing our 100 albums that must be in your collection, according to moi. We're at number 44, and it's time to talk about Bob Dylan. And there's a million albums we could talk about on Bob Dylan's vinyl discography. You know, when things started switching to CD in the 80s and everybody was like, we got everything on CD. I was part of that, but there were certain things that I would not give up on vinyl. As Dylan would put out albums in the 80s on CD, I would only buy them on vinyl. His old stuff, I would only buy them on vinyl. It was only by the late 90s, I was like, I guess I should buy some of the stuff on CD. So I've always thought Dylan sounds best on vinyl, and any album you take from Bob Dylan's catalog, you can talk about. So I wanted, since we're trying to do some of the ones that aren't the usual suspects in this 100 count through, I wanted to pick one that is by many people hated, by many people seen as the worst Dylan album, and I love it dearly. We're talking about, of course, the 1970 release Self-Portrait. The double album Self-Portrait was a bit of a shocker when it came out. It followed up 1969's very successful Nashville Skyline with the big hit Late Lady Late. Dylan was working with Johnny Cash, among other people, and really refining his sound in the late 1960s. He went through all these phases. You know, Dylan has many phases. Starts off as sort of the folky, then like the protest singer, then goes electric, and then with Blonde on Blonde, the double album before this, gets more, I wouldn't say psychedelic, but more surreal in his lyrics. Sad-Eyed Lady of the Lowland, to name but one. Gets in a motorcycle accident, kind of takes 67 off for the most part. At the end of 67, releases John Wesley Harding, which is kind of a weird Americana album, All Along the Watchtower. And then in 1969, Nashville Skyline comes out, and he's singing in this weird affect, this weird country, nasally country voice that I still can't quite figure out. Some people have said it's because he stopped smoking, but a few years later, he was back to his old normal singing voice. So I don't know why he's just putting on this act. And then this album comes out, and it lands in many ways with a thud. It was very successful. It went to number 3 on the U.S. album charts and number 1 in Great Britain. But the Rolling Stone, the Robert Christgau review in Rolling Stone just said, "What is this shit?" Because by the end of the 60s, Dylan was somewhat of an icon, a legend, often referred to as the voice of his generation. There were such great expectations. And what this album is some cover songs, like traditional folk songs, kind of like some of the records he did in the 90s. A few originals, covers of like Simon and Garfunkel songs. There's the Boxer on here. And then some live stuff from the Isle of Wight concert from '69, which we'll talk about in a moment. It was really sort of a hodgepodge of stuff, and it didn't really fit the expectation of what a Bob Dylan album should be like at the dawn of a new decade in 1970, when this comes out in June of 1970. It was produced by Bob Johnston, who Dylan had worked with before, who also worked with Johnny Cash and Simon and Garfunkel. It turns out a lot of these songs were sessions from the recordings from the Late Lady Lay sessions. Some of them were recordings with the band. Some of them were just him. And what was going on here, when trying to make sense of this record, what was going on here was something very interesting from an artistic standpoint. And I think we've seen varying versions of this before. Dylan was lifted up to such great heights. Dylan, right? Just one name, Dylan. He was meant to be sort of a salvation, a prophet, the greatest poet that ever lived. I mean, there was all this stuff put on his shoulders, and he was living in upstate New York in Woodstock. And in 1969, this is when the Woodstock Festival was happening, and so there's all this energy around Dylan in Woodstock. and he was just fed up. He was just like, I don't want to be that guy. I'm not that guy. They've created this thing that I'm not. They've created this sort of image of this person that's not me. And I'm not going to save a generation. I'm not going to be a voice of a generation. I'm not, I'm just this guy who likes music. And so the general consensus, or the kind of the contemporary understanding, including based on some of the things that Dylan later said in interviews, is that he wanted to put out something really crappy. In fact, he thought, if you're going to put out crap, you might as well put out a double album of crap and cram as much crap on there as you can. And maybe it'll shake loose this expectation that I'm here to save the world, that Bob Dylan is this giant godlike figure and not a fallible human being who can sometimes make missteps. And so it in of itself is intended to be a bad album. But you know what? It's not. In it, there's all these wonderful moments, and I just sort of had it, because I had to have every Bob Dylan album, so I had this in my collection. And then I was doing a road trip across the country, and I had it on a cassette, maybe a CD, and I was driving across the desert in Utah, and I put this album on, and I thought I was going to have a frickin' religious experience. It so captured the expanse of the desert that I was in. Kind of later in '73, when the Pat Garrett and the Billy the Kid album comes out, similar to that vibe, there is just this bigness with it. These traditional songs, great songs like Copper Kettle that sound very Appalachian. There is instrumental, or sort of instrumentals, where he's kind of singing like Wigwam, which I just think is one of the best things. Wigwam ended up in the Royal Tenenbaums, and a lot of people discovered that. All the Tired Horses ended up in the movie Blow. Like, over the years, people have gone back to this record and been like, hold on a second, there's some really great stuff on this record. Yeah, Blue Moon is kind of dumb, and the Simon and Garfunkel, there's some stuff on here that you don't really need. But there are these great moments of Dylan getting in touch with the music that he just likes to listen to and that he is inspired by. And so there is this strange revelation in this record that was meant to make people hate it. It's really great. In fact, there was a part of his bootleg series, volume 10 of his bootleg series, went back to this sort of era from 69 to 70 and reissued a bunch of these tracks and discovered some lost things. And they're all freaking brilliant. They're Dylan destroying his image. They're sort of chipping away at this thing that had been created by people on the outside to just give him his sort of pure self. In that sense, it's revelatory, it's personal, and it is an insight into this guy. Now, one of the things is, I think about Dylan is 83, still touring. He's on tour right now. In fact, I think Andy is going to see him next week out in the Gorge. We're probably not going to get a lot of records from Bob Dylan. There's not a lot coming from him. Every single day we've got him on the planet is a gift. But I doubt we're going to get that many more pieces of new recorded music for him. So a lot of our energy has been going back and kind of rediscovering the things that we might have skipped over. And this record is just so much fun to listen to because it's so much the anti-Dylan record. One of the things that's really cool on this record is 4 songs from his Isle of Wight concert on August 31st, 1969, off the coast of England. This was his first concert in 3 years, first live performance in 3 years, and it was well attended, including by John Lennon, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr and their wives, including Yoko. Keith Richards was there. Jane Fonda was there. Eric Clapton was there. Syd Barrett from Pink Floyd was there. I mean, everybody was there. And after the show, the Beatles went back to the farmhouse that he was recording in and gave him a test pressing of the new album they just finished called Abbey Road. They invited him to come back to London. He didn't come back to London with them. And Paul McCartney would have been there, but Linda just had Mary 2 days earlier, their daughter Mary, and he couldn't make it down because good old Paul was taking care of the baby. So the story is that John was hoping that Dylan would invite the 3 Beatles up on stage to jam. But the show got started so late. Like he was the last act of the bill, and he went on at 11 and played for an hour. And by the end of that, at midnight, everybody was just sort of falling over from being at this festival all day long, and it never happened. But it's one of those things of what if. When you think about the Traveling Wilburys, early version where it's George Harrison and Bob Dylan, and also John Lennon and Ringo Starr. I mean, that almost happened. So the recording from Isle of Wight is on this record, the 4 songs, where he's singing in the weird Nashville skyline voice. 4 months later, he puts out New Morning, which is kind of a return to form. He has that great song, If Not For You, that he wrote with George Harrison, and the following year plays it in Madison Square Garden at George Harrison's concert for Bangladesh. Sounds like old Bob Dylan again. Sounds like Bob Dylan 1964. Gone is the nasally country voice, and Bob Dylan is sort of rejoins the 70s and begins a normal recording career and all the great music that he put out in the 70s. But this album is strange and beautiful, and is not the album that you would go to. You go to Blood on the Tracks, you go to Blonde on Blonde, you go to Highway 61 Revisited, you go to Freewheelin'. I mean, those are the Dylan albums, even Time Out of Mind. Those are the Dylan albums you go to. There's probably a good chance you're going to skip over Nashville Skyline. So I'm going to urge you, especially if you can find it on the double vinyl album, plop it down, imagine you're in the desert in Utah, and just sort of disappear into the world of Dylan deconstructing himself. There he is. I'm not the man you think I am. I'm me. And even the album cover is reflective of how Dylan was trying to deconstruct himself. He just found some paints that were lying around in his house in Woodstock that somebody left out. Said it took 5 minutes to do this. Didn't have an album title when he gave it to the record label. They were like, what are you going to call it? He said, I don't know. Let's call it Self-Portrait. I mean, there wasn't a lot of energy put into this thing that now is this sort of little weird classic that emerges in 1970. I love it. I love it. If you've got some Dylan in your collection, add this one to it. We're gonna come back to Dylan on vinyl. I've got something very special when we get to the second 50. It's a Bob Dylan album that I don't think a lot of you have. But in the meantime, next week we've got a great album. So many of these records changed my life. We're going to talk about one that definitely changed my life. We're going to talk about the B-52s, the first B-52s album, self-titled 1979. Got to talk about the B-52s. That's next on Vinyl Fetish. Bob Dylan matters. Bob Dylan is still on tour, the tour that never ends. It keeps on going. It just sounds weirder and weirder each time. He gets older and craggier, but he's still Bob Dylan. He's still out there for us. We still live in a world where he breathes and makes music. So let's take a moment to appreciate that. Bob Dylan matters. This weird album matters. This music matters. You matter. So let's talk about it.